Hello, welcome to the video about the decline of witch persecution. This is what we're going to be looking at. I won't go into detail, you can read that for yourself, but the when and the where, possible reasons for the decline, so the different factors that may have caused the decline in witch hunting, and then a conclusion at the end where we hopefully will have a bit of a better idea. Okay, so when did witch hunting decline and when did it actually end are two different things, as we're going to see. But let's talk about the pattern of decline first of all. So witch persecution in Western Europe certainly was generally declining from the 1630s onwards. Sometimes it was after, sometimes it was before, but generally most places in Europe, Western Europe in the 1630s, witch hunting was in a state of decline. In Eastern Europe it was later than that. So we can see that actually the earliest place that witch persecution had started to decline was in the Dutch Republic in the 1500s, which was a quite religiously tolerant area. They had a peak early on, but they also had a decline early on. In Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe where witch hunting didn't get going until later, then actually the decline tended to be later as well, as you can see. Now sometimes the decline was quite gradual, so the cases dropped off over time, but sometimes the decline in cases was very sudden. Now often that was the result of a big mass chain reaction witch hunt that had got out of hand, and as a result of that there was a reaction against it. So often in the southern German states, if there was a big chain reaction witch hunt, that normally then led to a reaction where there was a drop off in cases afterwards. Now many countries eventually removed the notion of witchcraft as a crime. They changed the law to say it was no longer a crime, but often this came after a period of declining prosecutions and cases anyway. So it was not a cause for these declining cases. It usually came afterwards. So to give you an example, in England the last trial was in 1717, the last execution 1685, but the law didn't actually change to say witchcraft wasn't a crime until 1736. Same sort of pattern in France. You had declining cases way before the law actually changed in 1682, and the same in the Habsburg monarchies as well. And even if the law did change, even if, you know, say in England in 1736, the idea was that witches were no longer a thing and you couldn't punish them, that didn't actually stop people believing in them. The common people, if you like, those superstitions did continue. The difference was that if they did anything about it, if they accused their neighbours or even took violent action against them, they now were breaking the law. So let's now try and unpick what the reasons were why this decline in cases actually happened. It's tempting to look for a really simple explanation, and this is perhaps one of the more simple explanations, and like most simple explanations, there's a big problem with it. Scientific thinking. Well, if we look at these two pictures, in the first picture, you know, you've got this very superstitious worldview, the witch's Sabbath, you've got flights, you've got all sorts of, you know, mad stuff going on. And then if you look at this very rational painting of the 1760s, it shows a scientific experiment going on, and it's showing two completely different mindsets. So it's tempting to think, oh right, well people just became much more scientific in their thinking and no longer believed in witches. But it ain't that simple. So it is true that there was a shift in the way some people were thinking about the world. There was a more inquiring frame of mind, and this started to get going in the sort of 16th century, in the 1500s really. So we can think of two standout figures, Copernicus and Galileo. And Copernicus came up with the notion that the planets orbited the sun and turned the whole idea of everything orbiting the Earth on its head. Galileo similarly dealt with astronomy. So what they're both doing is they are arguing that there are natural laws that govern the universe, and this sort of sets the path for what was later called the scientific revolution, which is characterized by people like Isaac Newton, who discovers gravity. The idea that you should question traditional ideas, test things through experiment and observation. So that's quite seductive, isn't it? You think, well, yeah, these people wouldn't believe in witches. They would point out to the world how silly such beliefs were. But again, it's not that simple, because these are very small numbers of scientific people in a very separate world from the world in which most witchcraft cases are being generated by, that village community. And so there's a very slow trickle down of their ideas to the ordinary people, to the public. And even to the elites as well. So the educated elite, even the literate elite, these ideas are not suddenly available to them. It takes a long time for these ideas to permeate and to be recognised. I mean, for a start, Galileo at first and Copernicus are criticised for their ideas. And you could actually believe in some of the new science. It was called natural philosophy at the time. But you could believe in some of these new scientific ideas, but still continue to hold a belief in witchcraft. And educated men continued to do that right up until the end of the 1600s, the 17th century. Geoffrey Scar and John Callow, two historians, they've got a great quote about this. They say the theories of scientific revolutionaries did not obtain a firm basis in educated consciousness until the age of witch trials was past. So it had already finished. So yes, it's true that it's the educated elites that control the court system and all the rest of it, and whether witch accusations turn into a witch hunt. That's true, but these same educated elites did not get to grips with these new scientific ideas until witchcraft had already declined anyway. So that's the big point. This is not a cause for the decline. It's one we have to rule out. So if it's not scientific scepticism, what is it? Well, Brian Levac, my hero, obviously, he has coined a phrase called judicial scepticism. So it's not really a change to the law as such, but it's a change to the way courts are working, the way that judges are considering evidence. This idea that in the 17th century there is more scepticism in the legal process about witches. So there's a continued belief in the possibility that witches exist. That's a given. It doesn't go away for a long time. But what there is an increased central control over local courts. There's a move away from the use of torture, and there is a move towards demanding higher standards of evidence and proof in cases of witchcraft. And we're going to have a look at all three of those in a bit more detail. Okay, so this is the first of the three aspects of judicial scepticism outlined by Levac. So if witchcraft persecution starts to decline from the 1630s onwards, what Levac says is that coincides with a period in which across Europe there is tightening central control over local courts, that states and governments are getting a firmer grip over the legal system in their country at all the different levels. So to give you an example of why this is quite a good argument, if you look at those areas where there were the worst outbreaks of witch hunting, they did have weak control over their legal systems, a decentralised, fragmented legal system. So if you look at the Holy Roman Empire, you can see all of these different places on the map. Now, in theory, you've got an emperor, but actually, in reality, the emperor had very little power over all of these states. They were semi-autonomous, some were, you know, quite independent, they could do their own thing. And so you had lots of local rulers in the smaller states, sort of small local rulers, who did their own thing, really, and they ignored the Carolina, which was the central legal code. You didn't have to follow it, and there was no way that the emperor could make these different states follow it. So if they had followed it, then those people accused of witchcraft would have had the right to appeal to a higher imperial court and all the rest of it, but they didn't follow it, so it was ignored. And so if you were accused in one of these smaller states of being a witch, you then had no right to appeal, and with no right to appeal, there's no one to sort of overturn what the local courts come up with, which might be for all sorts of reasons. Now, in those areas where there was a strong central control over the court system, you didn't have big outbreaks of witch hunting. So in Spain, even though it's the church that's doing the Inquisition, which is part of the church, which is investigating witchcraft, you could appeal if you were accused to a higher court called the Suprema, and that effectively stopped there from being any large-scale witch hunting in Spain. In France, they had the same sort of thing. If you were accused by a local court, you could appeal to the regional court, to the parliament. So there was a big outbreak in Champagne-Ardenne of witch hunting. The locals were effectively forming lynch mobs and doing all sorts of terrible things. That ended when that regional court got involved and restored its own authority. In England, we had very few examples of witch hunts, or perhaps notably the East Anglian hunt is the big example. That happened because the strong central control over the legal system was disrupted by the Civil War. You can see that in the other video. As soon as that assize system starts to restore control, the witch hunting comes to an end. Good example to have up your sleeve for an essay is in Würzburg. So it's part of the Holy Roman Empire. It's one of these smaller independent states. The witch hunts really got out of hand. It ends in about 1630. It's lasted 3 years. There's been a total breakdown in this chain reaction hunt. People have been naming lots of other people under torture, and it gets so out of hand that actually the members of the elite are being accused and all sorts of things are happening. It's not just old poor women anymore. And a man called Johann Burckhardt, who had legal training, is himself accused. He's locked up in the special witch prison that they had in Würzburg. He escapes. He manages to get to an area in the Holy Roman Empire where he can appeal to the higher imperial court, and they effectively then get involved and they restore control, and the witch hunt ends. So increased centralised control over local courts definitely stops witch hunts from happening, and the 1630s onwards is a period where this is a feature. Okay, the second thing is there's a general move in this period away from the use of torture. Now, torture had been traditionally used on the continent to secure confessions from witches. But in the 17th century, in the 1600s, there is an increasingly passionate attack on the use of torture. Now, there'd always been criticism of torture, but it really starts to intensify, particularly in the German-speaking parts of the Holy Roman Empire. So to give you some examples, there's a chap called Frederick Spey on the Catholic side. He's a Jesuit. He had witnessed torture during the Würzburg witch trials, and he made the point, well, look, why is there so much witchcraft in German-speaking areas compared to other parts of Europe? He said it's the mother of so many witches, and he attacked the use of torture. He wrote a book called Socio Criminalis, and he said that the confessions you get, the evidence you get from torture is unreliable. And other Jesuits on the Catholic side agree with him. Adam Tanner, Paul Lehmann. Now, on the other side, the implausibly but hilariously named Johann Mayfart stresses the cruelty and suffering that torture inflicts. Johann Grieve on the Protestant side takes this further. He says, you know, there is no excuse for a Christian to torture another Christian. It's fundamentally unchristian belief. So there's an increasing attack on not just the morality of torture, but the reliability of using it to get a confession. Now, why is torture such a big deal, and why does the move away from torture reduce witchcraft? Well, let's think about it. In those areas where torture had never been generally used, there had been no large-scale witch hunts. So in England, they'd not used torture generally to secure confessions, okay, for those 200 years, 1500 to 1700. When they do have dodgy Matthew Hopkins and John Stern using torture-like methods, there's a witch hunt. Now, of course, that's not the only reason there was a witch hunt in East Anglia. There's other reasons as well, but that's a contributing factor, was the torture that was used. So the move away from that in the 1600s and the increasing criticism means that perhaps you're going to get fewer women prepared to confess the crime of witchcraft, and you're going to get fewer judges willing to accept that kind of evidence. So all of this kind of links together for the third strand, that there is a general move towards, in the legal system, towards higher standards of evidence and proof in cases of witchcraft. So there's three reasons for this. There's a growing distrust of confessions. So traditionally, confessions were used in witch cases. So a woman confesses to a pact with the devil or attendance at the Sabbath. And increasingly in the 17th century, there's this belief that if women are confessing to things like this, even if they're confessing freely and not because they've been tortured, it's probably a sign that they're mentally ill. Now, there's no conception of mental illness as we understand it. They called it melancholy, but it was this belief that you weren't in your right mind, that you were vulnerable. And the more sort of fantastical the confession might be, you know, I flew to the Sabbath and did dance with the devil and trample upon the cross, the more sort of extreme it was, the less likely, actually, that the confession would be taken seriously. So there's this real move away from the idea that you can trust in a confession. And there's this belief that actually, if there is a possible natural explanation for an event, then that has to be taken into account. So let's say someone's been accused of using harmful magic, maleficia, your cow has died. Okay, your cow's died. But if it's possible that there's a natural cause for that rather than the witch being guilty, then you cannot find them guilty. You cannot prosecute them, actually, even. That you just can't take it forward. Now, in Spain, a good example of this tendency, this growing tendency, this looking for natural explanations. In Spain, there was a witch hunt 1609 to 11, and the inquisitors who were investigating this were instructed to look for natural causes for apparent maleficia. So this effectively prevented the witch hunt continuing. Okay, in Italy, there had been some accusations of child murder, infanticide by witches, and the investigators looking into the case took physicians who examined the body of the children to look for possible natural causes. So there is now the burden of proof on the accuser. If there is any doubt that this might be caused by a natural phenomenon as opposed to a supernatural phenomenon, if there's any doubt that, you know, that a witch didn't do this and there's any other explanation, the prosecution wouldn't go forward. And there is also this growing reluctance to accept the testimony of children. Children did a lot of the accusations, especially in chain reaction witch hunts. And there's this move away from the idea that somehow witchcraft cases are different to any other case, that they're this exceptional crime, the crimen exceptum. There's this belief that, you know, witchcraft should be treated like any other crime. The same standards of proof should be accepted. So that's Levac's ideas about judicial scepticism, but what might be socio and economic causes for the decline in witchcraft? Well, there is improvement, sort of arguably after about 1650. So there's a drop off in those price rises, the inflation. There's some improvement in people's wages, so effectively, you know, that they can afford more with what they're earning. There is evidence that warfare is subsiding in this period. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, has ended. There's evidence that some of the plague pandemics that were burning through Europe were sort of exhausting themselves by this period. And there's a bit of an economic upturn. Now, how does this link to witchcraft cases? Well, we know from the work we've done on the causes of the witch hunters that, you know, socioeconomic problems could cause that upsurge in witchcraft accusations. So if things get better, it's not unnatural to argue that there'll be a decline. And so this has been, you know, some historians have said this improvement has led to a decline in crisis mentality and this sort of feeling of crisis and uncertainty. And so people are less likely to point to witches and blame them for their problems because they've got fewer problems. Now, another possible reason for the decline in witch cases is the change that was going on in religious thinking at the time. Now, by the 1630s, when this decline starts, the Reformation, which, you know, we're really talking about, starts in 1517, really starts to intensify by the 1520s, 30s, 40s. The Counter-Reformation gets going. But by about, that's the Catholic Church fighting back, by about the 1630s, this has died down. The debate has settled down. Pretty much countries in Europe, states in Europe, know whether they're Catholic, know whether they're Protestant now. So there's this period of more religious tolerance, and so there's less emphasis by rulers in Europe to create this godly state, this purified society, because the debate has calmed down and there's more certainty and less religious fluidity. Now, the other change to religious thinking at the time is that there's been a closer study of the Bible. And when theologians have studied the Bible in more detail, they've you know, pulled out from it that there's barely any mention of witchcraft. And there's certainly no mention at all of devil worship, which completely contradicts one of the big supporting pillars for persecuting witches, which is this idea of the diabolical pact. There's no mention of it at all in the Bible or Scripture. And that's one of the changes that starts to come out of this closer study of the Bible. There's also this growing belief in the argument that God is sovereign. So God has supreme power. So if harmful magic does occur in the world, it's only because God is allowing it to happen. It's part of his grand design, in which case the punishment of witches should end. And finally, there's this belief that God has created the universe. And this does link to maybe some changing scientific ideas. That's difficult to prove, but that God creates a universe, but it runs itself once he's created it. He's created it like a big machine, if you like, that it follows certain rules and patterns and movements and all the rest of it. And that therefore he doesn't then intervene. He doesn't need to. He set it in motion. So therefore there's no miracles. But if there are no miracles, there's no belief then in the sort of flip side of that, which is diabolical power. So there's not everybody has this belief, but there is this growing tendency in religious thinking to see God's creation in that way. So there's less room for the power of God at large in the world, but also the power of the devil. Okay, so another reason for the possible decline in witch hunting was to do with the experience of witch hunting itself. So if we look at one of the reasons why large-scale witch hunting took place, it was often to do with the urge to create a godly state, or in England a godly commonwealth in East Anglia. In other words, rulers having this idea that they need to purify society and remove any deviant elements from society in order to make it a Christian, stable society. That's the theory. In practice, witch hunting could often have a destabilizing effect because it led to fear and destruction. And so if you had one of these hunts, you would realize if it got out of hand that sometimes innocent people, godly people, were being killed. So there's this growing awareness that in a witch hunt, innocent people could die, that false accusations could be made, particularly by children. So let me give you two examples of the effect that this had. In southern Germany, in Würzburg, 1630, at the end of a sort of 3 to 5 year hunt, 160 individuals had been executed. Now, the stereotype of the witch had completely broken down. The use of torture had led to lots of people naming others. And so you ended up with a mayor's wife, the wife of a former chancellor, a councillor, 3 councillors' wives, lots of members of the elite being accused. Now, this could happen if torture was used and there was a chain reaction hunt where people were naming others. So it had spiralled out of control. And so at the end of that, people looked at the whole experience of it and thought, well, perhaps this is a destabilizing thing. So the elites would not want to encourage it, certainly as they got accused themselves. East Anglia in England, with Matthew Hopkins, after that hunt had ended, there was a real reaction against witch hunting in that area and in England more generally, because it was pretty clear that a lot of those who had been executed were probably innocent. So that's another contributing factor to the decline in witch persecution. Okay, so what are we left with? Well, those are the 5 reasons we've considered. Probably we can discount the impact of new scientific thinking because it takes too long to filter through. It's likely that judicial scepticism was a very important factor, and it's possible that links to the changes in religious thinking. It's possible too that all of these things were informed by the experience of the witch hunts themselves, and the fact that just by experiencing a witch hunt you could observe that innocent people were sometimes being accused. And probably tied into this somewhere along the line is the idea that with the social economic condition improving, there's less emphasis, or less need rather, to scapegoat people, to blame them for various problems. So there could be some overlap, there could be some links between these different factors, and I would invite you to think about that. But if I had to stick my neck out on this, I would say that the key reason is the judicial scepticism argument, because that doesn't mean people didn't believe in witches. That belief continued, but the change to the legal system made it harder for those local pressures to accuse often vulnerable old poor women. Those local pressures, they couldn't go anywhere. If the elites were exercising some measure of judicial scepticism, then those beliefs would not transform into a large-scale witch hunt.